On the morning of September the 3rd, 1904, a miner named Thomas Aloysius Wickes was 40 feet into a lateral drive on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot range when his pick broke through into empty air. Wickes had staked the claim 2 years earlier on ground that had only recently been opened to American mineral entry, land that the Salish Pen d'Oreille had occupied for centuries before a sequence of federal agreements relocated the tribal members north to the Flathead Reservation in the 1890s. The last of them, a band under Chief Charlo, had held out in the Bitterroot Valley until 1891, when federal officials and a detachment of soldiers arrived to escort them north, under terms most of the band had not agreed to, and that Charlo himself rejected until the moment he had no other choice. By the time Wickes filed, the valley was American homestead land. The foothills east of Corvallis, where he had traced ore indications up a drainage the previous summer, had been available for claim since the 1893 land opening. He ran the operation with one other man, a Cornish driller named Samuel Pendray, whom he had worked alongside in the silver camps of Colorado before both of them came north to Montana. The void his pick opened into was not the small gas pocket or mineral vug a miner might expect in this formation. When he passed a candle through the gap, the flame drew inward rather than flaring in the current of displaced air. The space beyond was pulling air from the workings. Wickes spent the next 2 hours with his hammer and chisel before he could force his shoulders through. What he found on the other side would be documented 6 weeks later by a territorial geologist named Howard Calhoun, who learned of the find through the Ravalli County Assay Office and traveled to the site in October before the claim changed hands and a lock went on the entrance. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The chamber Wickes entered was approximately 12 feet across at its widest and 8 feet from floor to ceiling at its highest point, following the natural curve of the surrounding rock for roughly 35 feet before it terminated at a wall of dressed stone. The blocks had been cut to a consistent thickness of approximately 2.5 inches each and set in level courses that held their line across the full width of the chamber. Calhoun measured the wall at just over 7 feet in height and found no variation in the course levels that would suggest the construction had occurred across more than one period of building, with different hands working at different times. The mortar between the blocks had partially calcified, a process that under the temperature and moisture conditions of that elevation and rock type advances at a rate consistent with centuries rather than decades. What he did record, in the clearest language in his surviving pages, was that the stone had been worked to a standard that required planning, practiced tools, and sustained effort, and that the block faces were smooth in a way the natural fracturing patterns of that formation do not produce. Beyond the fitted wall, which Wickes and Pendray had broken through before Calhoun arrived, the inner chamber continued for another 20 feet. The floor showed 3 separate burning areas, each a low, contained circle, spaced at roughly equal intervals across the rock. The ash in each had been compressed into the floor surface itself, rather than resting loose on top of it, pressed into the stone in a pattern that Calhoun, drawing on his experience documenting burn sites across the territory, described as consistent with fires maintained repeatedly at the same location over a span of time long enough for accumulated heat and carbon to alter the composition of the rock beneath them. He was deliberate about his language here. He wrote that the word he chose was repeatedly, and that he chose it because the evidence did not permit a softer description. Fire does not press itself into stone in a season. A season leaves ash on the surface. What the Wickes inner chamber showed was ash in the surface. He sketched the layout of the 3 rings and their relative positions. The sketch appears on page 2 of the 4 surviving pages of his report. The objects Calhoun recorded in the inner section were 5 in number. 2 stone mauls, each shaped from a quartzite absent from the local geological formations, their working faces worn to the rounding that sustained contact with hard ore produces over many hours of use. A section of copper sheet that had been thinned by cold hammering to less than 1/4 inch and then folded at precise, evenly spaced intervals, a pattern Calhoun described as deliberate construction rather than accidental deformation. a bone point, worn smooth along one working edge, and, pressed beneath the ash deposit of the largest fire ring, and covered with a thin layer of loose material placed deliberately on top of it, a carved piece of antler, approximately 8 inches in length, bearing a series of parallel lines cut at regular intervals into its upper surface. Calhoun counted 27 lines. He noted that each cut was of similar depth and consistent spacing throughout, that the tool marks showed a consistent angle and hand across all of them, and that the regularity of the work ruled out hasty or casual production. He sketched the piece on page 3 of his report. He did not speculate about what the lines counted. What the 27 lines do not show is also part of Calhoun's record. There is no crowding at the end, no line cut closer to its neighbor because space was running short, no apparent pressure to continue past the 27th. The count stopped at 27 because whoever was keeping it last came to the chamber, cut the final line, and did not come back. Not because the antler ran out of room, because the person who held the count ran out of time in which to return. The copper sheet deserves particular attention within this inventory. Cold hammering native copper to a 1/4 inch thickness and then folding it at consistent measured intervals is not a skill that develops through a single attempt. It represents practiced knowledge, an understanding of how the metal responds to percussion at different stages of compression that accumulates through time and repetition. The sheet's folds were precise. Whatever form it was being worked toward, its production reflected prior experience with the same process. That kind of knowledge does not appear in isolation. It travels with the people who hold it. In November of 1904, Calhoun sent a summary of his findings to the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington. The Bureau was at that time actively fielding investigators across the West in response to indigenous cultural discoveries, a well-resourced operation with a documented record of responding to exactly this class of find. It acknowledged his letter in December. No investigator was dispatched. Calhoun appears to have followed up once, in a brief note the following spring. No reply to that note appears in his surviving papers. The Wickes claim was sold in January of 1905 to a holding company with ties to the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. The sale agreement, filed with the Missoula County Recorder's Office, assigned all minerals and artifacts found on the property to the purchaser. In a letter to his brother written in Corvallis in December of 1904, Wickes mentioned having the copper sheet and one of the stone mauls at his home. After the sale, that letter trail closes. The holding company's records for the property, covering operations through 1917, contain no reference to cultural material received or held from the original Wickes workings. Calhoun returned to Helena after his October visit and took up a survey assignment in the Judith Basin the following spring. He published a geological note on copper mineralization in the Bitterroot foothills in 1907 that contains no reference to the Wickes find, the chamber, or anything documented in his October report. His subsequent career produced substantial output on ore geology across central Montana. He did not publish on pre-contact underground structures in any format that has been located. What the record shows, taken together, is a discovery that moved through a sequence of filters and was returned to silence at each one. The miner reported it to the county assay office. The geologist documented it and forwarded the summary to Washington. Washington acknowledged it and sent no one. The claim changed hands, the sale agreement removed the objects from Wickes' ownership on paper, and the geologist went on to other work. The object that most directly encoded whatever the chamber had been used for, the antler piece with its 27 lines, ended up on a private shelf in Corvallis. Then on no shelf that anyone has been able to locate since. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one. The language the Salish Territorial brought to the Bitterroot Valley holds a distinction that the Jesuit ethnographer Father Gregory Mengarini recorded during his years at St. Mary's Mission in the 1840s, 4 decades before the federal removal campaign reached its decisive phase. Mengarini was not an ethnographer in the disciplinary sense. He was a linguist and a missionary. But his notes from those years survive in Jesuit archives and have been examined by scholars working on interior Salish documentation. Those notes describe a category of place the language treated as distinct from ordinary surface ground. He transliterated the term as something close to Sxļp and glossed it in his writing as the held place, or the place that contains. The word applied specifically to underground locations understood to stand in a deliberate relationship with the people who held their names, not simply a cave or a hollow, but a space that had been placed in that relationship through recognition and sustained use across generations. Knowledge of these locations was held within specific family lines and passed through recognized succession rather than available as general geographic information. Mengarini noted that entering one without what he described as the appropriate acknowledgement carried a practical consequence, a disruption of the relationship between the person and the ground itself, that the Salish understood as something that could be damaged by inattention. His notes on this point run to less than a page before he returns to his primary theological concerns. By the time Wickes filed his claim in 1902, the families who carried the inherited knowledge of the held places in those particular foothills had been on the Flathead Reservation for over a decade. Whatever names specific underground locations in the Corvallis drainage carried within Salish family knowledge had no channel by which to reach the man now driving a lateral toward them. The held place in the mountain had continued to hold its contents in the dark, with no one coming back. The mine log Wickes kept for the claim covers the period from June of 1904 through the January sale, with almost no gaps, entries appearing for most working days throughout that summer and fall in a consistent hand. The entries for September the 3rd, 4th and 5th are absent. The log resumes on September the 6th, with a notation about the powder inventory and a remark on overnight frost. The hand of that first entry after the gap is different from the hand in the entries immediately preceding it. Not a different log, not a replacement volume, but a different hand for that specific entry before the original hand resumes on September the 7th. The log is held in a private collection in Missoula. Two researchers examining it since 1987 have each confirmed the 3-day absence and the change of hand. A mine log written by a two-man operation does not ordinarily produce a change of hand in the middle of a working week. The two men present on the property were Wickes and Pendray. One of them chose not to write down what happened on September the 3rd, 4th and 5th. The other wrote the 6th. Neither ever explained it in any document that has been found. The Wickes chamber was not the only account of its kind in western Montana in the first 2 decades of the century. In 1911, a mining surveyor named Albert Krause, working a silver prospect in the Flint Creek Valley for a Deer Lodge syndicate, broke into a natural cavity in the course of a drainage survey. His field notes, partially transcribed by a historian reviewing the syndicate's records in the 1960s, describe finding within the cavity a section of cold-hammered copper pipe worked to a diameter of approximately 1 inch, running along the lower wall of the chamber for a distance of 14 feet before ending at a fractured break. The pipe directed water from a seep in the upper rock toward a point on the chamber floor where the stone had been worn into a smooth depression roughly 3 feet across, consistent with concentrated and repeated use at that specific location over time. Krause collected a section of the pipe and submitted it to the syndicate office in Anaconda. The asset inventory for 1911 lists it, the inventory for 1912 does not. In the Stillwater River drainage further east, a rancher named Clarence Holt, described in a 1922 affidavit, filed as part of a water rights proceeding at the Stillwater County Courthouse, entering a hillside opening he had initially taken for a bear den. Past a narrow constriction, the passage opened into a space he described as too regular to have formed without direction, containing a flat stone surface at approximately waist height with 2 round depressions worn into it, each about the diameter of a large cooking vessel. The stone smoothed in a way Holt associated with long repeated contact at those 2 specific points. He stored feed in the space for 2 winters before a partial collapse sealed the entrance. The affidavit records it because the space was part of his property description. There is no indication Holt reported the find to any authority beyond what the proceeding required. What connects these 3 accounts is not the specific objects, though the cold-hammered copper pipe in the Flint Creek cavity is the hardest detail to place within the established picture of pre-contact material technology in this part of the Northwest. What connects them is the shaped stone. Each space that a 20th century worker broke into showed rock that had been worked and worn to a standard requiring sustained use and return. The depression in the Flint Creek floor, the flat stone surface with its two symmetrical worn circles in the Stillwater Hollow, the fitted wall, and the three compressed fire rings in the Wickes chamber. None of these are the marks of a space visited once and left. They carry the marks of maintenance, of people who came back often enough and long enough to leave the stone itself changed by their coming. The held place distinction Mengarini recorded was not about mystery, it was about maintenance. A held place was held precisely by being returned to, by the people who carried its name and the knowledge of what it contained. The 27 lines on the antler piece in the Wickes chamber were cut with consistent tool pressure and consistent spacing. That is not the work of a single visit. It is a count accumulated across returns, maintained over time by people who came back to continue it. The carved antler piece Calhoun documented has never been traced to any institutional collection. It does not appear in the Montana Historical Society's holdings for that period, nor in the Smithsonian's accession records for 1904 or 5. In 1978, a historian in Stevensville interviewed Gerald Wickes, grandson of Thomas, who described a carved piece his grandfather had kept on the kitchen shelf in Corvallis until Thomas died in 1931. Gerald called it the marker, the same word his grandfather had used without ever explaining what it marked. He described the carving as a row of evenly spaced lines running the length of the piece. Thomas Wickes had told him once that the lines were a count of something. He never said what they counted. When Thomas died, his wife gave the piece to a neighbor. Gerald Wickes could not recall the name. 3 attempts to trace that transfer through address and estate records of that Corvallis neighborhood in the early 1930s have returned nothing. The piece has not been found. The mine that purchased the Wickes claim operated the copper ore through 1917 and then closed the workings. Underground tunnels were collapsed at closure as standard procedure for an abandoned operation in that period. The fitted chamber, accessible in 1904 only through the hole Wickes cut in the dressed stone wall, is sealed now under the mountain. The 3 fire rings, the calcified mortar, the ash pressed into the floor across its years of use, sealed. The 3-day absence in the mine log is still visible in the private collection in Missoula. The sketch of the 27 lines sits on page 3 of Calhoun's report in the Montana Historical Society archives. The object the sketch depicts has not been located by anyone looking for it since. The chamber Wickes entered on September 3, 1904, had not been lost. Lost implies something misplaced. What his pick broke through was the outer wall of a space maintained, deliberately and across time, by people whose descendants had been taken from that land 14 years before the moment of entry. The held place had continued to hold. The mortar had calcified, the ash had pressed itself into the floor across the span of its use, the 27 lines had stopped at 27, and the antler piece had been placed beneath the largest fire ring and covered, the last recorded action, in a space that its keepers had to leave without the option of return. The count on the antler marks the last visit anyone made before the knowledge of that place went north with the removal and left the ground to keep it on its own terms, in the dark, against the indifference of the mountain above it. The mine log says nothing about September the 3rd. The ground said everything else. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.